Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Live at Ejogam FM. My name is Vincenzo Berghella, and as you can see, I have lots of wonderful guests today again. Today, our focus on obstetrics randomized controlled trials. First, a very quick sad announcement. Yesterday, one of my best buddies, mentor, and teacher, Bud Wiener, died. I know many of you don't know this, and we're going to be shocked, but I needed to share this news. And sorry about that. Again, we're talking about teaching today and science, and he was a great science and teacher. We have, as you can see, Jekka Steinberg from Northwestern. Hi, Jekka. Katie Anderson from Brown. Hi, Katie. And Bruno from Utah. Hi, Ann. Yorgos Doulaveris from Einstein. Yorgos, and then they will be presenting their work published recently at the Pink Journal, and we also have Nathan and Deirdre from Utah and Stanford as their mentors and panelists. Hi, Nathan. Hi, Deirdre. Thanks for being with us. Let me give a quick background. You know, we all know the gold standard really for evidence in our field in medicine is randomized controlled trials. And that's why I've been so fixated for them. And I want to give you a quick personal story. You know, when I was a resident in New York, actually in Chinatown, New York, I randomized quite a few Chinese women back then consenting through Cantonese to stripping of membranes or not. And this was my first randomized studies. I really always believed in randomized trials. I'm glad this was finally published. It was a lot of work, and all of this work on randomized studies is really difficult. I've been honored to be part of maybe 20 or so randomized studies as co-author, and maybe 100 more as contributor and advisor and data safety boards. But many really changed practice, and that's really what the power of randomized studies I've seen is. It took me over 5 years with collaborators to publish kind of my fellowship project on cerclage and short cervix. I was lucky enough to help Joan Owen, who led the NIH much larger trial. And together, these two trials and three more eventually also changed practice. And really, the ideas from these randomized studies in obstetrics, you know, we estimate thousands of lives of babies can be saved by this procedure. And all guidelines, for example, follow guidance from these trials. I couldn't believe how long it took me in the first trial. It took me 5 years to randomize 61 women. It was like, drop of blood every patient, and lots of counseling. You know, I would counsel them, and one would say, I absolutely want cerclage. The next one would say, I absolutely don't want the cerclage. And it's really, I think, so important and ethical to actually randomize if we don't know the answer, because only by randomizing we'll get to the answer. M&S did a randomized study on cervical length for women with threatened preterm labor, which also kind of changed how we triage women with preterm labor with cervical length. This is a trial that people thought was never going to get done, sutures versus staples. When Danya McKean, a former fellow, started the fellowship, there were 50 patients in the world literature before 2010 or so. We didn't know how to close the skin. We actually bet with Danya that staples were going to be better. There was the standard back then, 15, 20 years ago. And instead, at the end, suture were better. Then she did the Cochrane and lots of other stuff. And around the world, 30 million plus C-sections, most of them, by our estimations, are closed by suture. This is the trial, actually, which was maybe even harder to do. When you get to 3 hours of second stage, should you push some more and wait? Should you not? Alex is randomized 78 women, which is a small little trial, but there are only 78 women randomized in the literature. Again, lots of work, and this I put in because I think that any trial really can be done, even the ones that seem the most daunting. And hopefully, the best thing is to get replicated, and I can't wait for this to be replicated soon. Corina Schoen, another former fellow, kind of paved the way with others to do 2 agents, like Foley and oxytocin, for example, compared to only 1 agent for induction, and we induce more and more women, as you know. And the latest, just last month, kind of probably another change of practice trial by our attending, a former fellow, Dr. Bolig, kind of showing the vaginal progesterone may be a better choice that I am. So just to show you that it's so difficult, in a kind of a lifetime, if you get involved in a few, that's great. But the more you get involved in, the better. And so when we started with AJOG-MFM, I put it in the very first editorial, now 3 years ago, that the priority, as you can see in the box, was going to be randomized, controlled trials, and we were going to try to publish good ones, quality ones, and as many as people would send us. And I want to thank everyone. You sent a lot of them, and we didn't publish everyone, but 44 have been published so far in AJOG-MFM. So pregnancy-related randomized trials. That has spurred more interest in randomized studies, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Kind of the big picture, we'll probably do other live streams at AJOG-MFM or randomized trials in obstetrics in general. But here we're going to start from how many are there, especially in pregnancy. Are they registered? Are they published? Where? And really the quality. So with that, I'm going to pass it first to Jekka, who's going to do this paper published in October 2020. And she'll be followed by Katie. We'll talk about quality criteria published in February of last year. And Bruno is going to talk about consort guidelines and some more rigor for randomized trials. And then Yorgos is going to kind of end it with the number and quality of randomized studies in obstetrics. Why don't you take it away then, Jekka? I can share your slides and you can take over.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Jekka Steinberg. I'm a resident from the Northwestern Feinberg School of Medicine, Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology. On behalf of my co-authors, thank you, AJOG-MFM, for inviting us to participate in this important discussion on obstetric clinical trials. So as was described, clinical trials represent a critical component of the research ecosystem and frequently guide evidence-based medicine and obstetrics. However, the benefits of clinical trials can only be realized when clinical trials reach completion and disseminate findings. Surprisingly, most clinical trials do not reach completion nor report results. So we conducted a study in which we aimed to characterize obstetric clinical trials between 2007 and 2020, to examine differences between obstetric and non-obstetric clinical trials, to analyze the association between funding and early discontinuation and results reporting, and to identify other trial features that may impact these outcomes. Towards that end, we performed a cross-sectional analysis of all clinical trials in obstetrics with an interventional study design, trials.gov, between October 2007 and March 2020. As one of the largest registries in the world, clinicaltrials.gov captures nearly half of all global trials and presents an exemplar database to investigate obstetric trials. Our primary exposure variable was funding, including government funding, academic funding, and industry funding. Our primary outcomes, we had early discontinuation, defined as trials that were stopped early, and then completed trials were further analyzed for results reporting to clinicaltrials.gov within 3 years of completion. We conducted descriptive analyses as well as multivariable logistic regression and Cox linear regression analyses. Our results. Of the over 220,000 clinical trials registered to clinicaltrials.gov, just over 4,200, 1.9%, focused on obstetrics. The number of obstetric trials increased over time at a faster rate than non-obstetric trials. Funding varied between obstetric and non-obstetric trials. Academic funding, as depicted in blue, funded the majority of obstetric trials, followed by government and then industry. Less than 0.5% of industry funding supported obstetric trials. There were several notable differences between obstetric and non-obstetric trials. Obstetric trials were less likely to be industry funded and more likely to focus on prevention and less likely to focus on treatment. Obstetric trials occurred more frequently in low and middle income countries than non-obstetric trials. Early discontinuation. Less than half of obstetric trials reached completion. Approximately 300 obstetric trials were discontinued early, around 7%. As you can see in this Kaplan-Meier curve, among obstetric trials, US government-funded trials, as depicted in yellow, had the lowest adjusted risk of early discontinuation. Compared to non-obstetric trials, obstetric trials had a greater adjusted risk of early discontinuation. Of all the therapeutic foci, cesarean trials and anesthesia trials were the most likely to discontinue early. Results reporting. Although over 1,400 obstetric trials reached completion, only just over 200, around 15%, reported results to clinicaltrials.gov. Academic-funded trials, depicted in blue, had the lowest adjusted odds of reporting results compared to other funders. Obstetric trials had similar adjusted odds of reporting results as non-obstetric trials. Of all the therapeutic foci, cesarean trials were the most likely to report results. Our study has several limitations. ClinicalTrials.gov is one of many global registries, and the study represents only a small sample of global clinical trials. ClinicalTrials.gov is limited by inconsistent data use by researchers and poor enforcement and validation of entry. Our conclusion. We found obstetric trials represent less of the clinical trial landscape. These trials are more likely to discontinue early than trials in other fields. When trials do reach completion, the vast majority do not report results. Notably, industry sponsorship of obstetric trials is less than for other trials. US government-funded obstetric trials are the most likely to meet consort recommendations for trial quality and to reach completion. Academic trials were the least likely to report results. When I reflect on the meaning behind these findings, the women who participated come to mind. When nearly 85% of completed trials do not disseminate results, that represents nearly 2 million pregnant people who risked their health to further reproductive medicine in completed trials that did not release findings. Their altruism, unreciprocated, captures the true harm in undisseminated trials. Thank you so much, AJOG MFM, for putting on this important discussion, to my co-authors and especially to Dr. Lyle for all of your incredible mentorship, to Stanford and Northwestern Departments of Obstetrics and Gynecology, and to my co-residents.
Jacka, that was great. You know, you made my blood boil, and you said it so beautifully. I think it's really unethical. You know, those people consented, put their pregnancy, I don't think at risk, but certainly, they were open and heroic and generous, into being randomized, and we didn't publish the results. I think that's an important thing. We're going to go through all the presentations first, and then open to discussion. The next presenter is Katie Anderson from Brown, our former medical students, being very proud of her, and she published this on quality criteria. Katie, why don't you take it away?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Bergella. So my name's Katie. Like Dr. Bergella said, I'm a resident at Brown. I'm really happy to be joining you all today to discuss further the quality criteria related to submission to journals of randomized controlled trials. So as we've already discussed, randomized controlled trials are truly the gold standard study design when trying to determine the effectiveness and/or safety of interventions in medicine. And as Jekka demonstrated, there's a great need for more randomized controlled trials, particularly in our field. But on top of that, we really need to ensure that the randomized trials that are being published are valid and that their data was obtained with integrity, because you can imagine the harm that falsified randomized controlled trials can have if their data is disseminated and potentially incorporated into practice guidelines. A recent study done by Dr. Bennett that was published in AJOG MFM in 2020 showed that in the Retraction Watch database, there were 122 retracted manuscripts in the field of obstetrics. And I imagine, since that time, there's even more that have been added. In unpublished data in a study that we're currently conducting, the mean time to retraction of these obstetric trials is about 5.5 years. And these trials have been cited a mean number of 16.5 times. So again, when these trials are published and they have falsified data, oftentimes that data may be disseminated and incorporated into other studies before the retraction actually occurs. So because of that, we're in great need to develop screening criteria for journals to really identify trials that may be at risk for future retraction and may be affected by scientific misconduct. This needs to happen really before that they are published and able to be, consumed by the general public. Different international organizations for research reporting, such as COPE and the ICMJE, have come out in recent years with specific criteria, in particular when reporting on randomized controlled trials. So these are things like the consort guidelines that were mentioned, as well as specific criteria for obtaining informed consent and ethical approval. However, amongst journals that publish randomized controlled trials in obstetrics, there's a lot of variation between what specific criteria are mandated upon submission. And this non-uniformity really poses a risk for some trials slipping through the cracks and being published. So we published this study in May of last year. It was myself and then joined by these co-authors who are the editors of the major journals in obstetrics and gynecology to really serve as a starting point to investigate this issue further. So in this study, we looked at both the author guidelines that are available on the journal websites, as well as we performed a mock submission of a blank randomized trial to assess what is required in the submission software for these journals. And we looked at 17 obstetric journals that publish RCTs, as well as the top 4 general medical journals by impact factor. And we really looked at what specific requirements were mandated upon submission in 5 general areas. These were related to trial registration, the ethical approval process, details regarding the trial protocol, adherence to consort guidelines, and then areas of statements of data sharing. And our objective is really to identify and compare the most common criteria that were required upon submission of trials amongst these journals. And our main outcome being the % of journals that require each of the specific criteria that we analyzed in either the guidelines or the submission software itself. And so what we really found were 7 specific criteria that were required on the majority of these journals. There was no significant difference between what was required in the top general medicine journals versus obstetrics, as well as the top 4 OBGYN journals versus the remainders. So these 7 criteria we found were inclusion or reporting of the trial registration number in a publicly available registry, the fact that the trial was prospectively registered, which means either prior to or within 14 days of first patient enrollment, inclusion of a statement of ethical approval for the study, as well as the name of the specific IRB or ethics committee that provided that approval, inclusion of a statement that all participants provided informed consent, statement that they abided by the consort guidelines when preparing the trial and the manuscript, and then inclusion of a data sharing statement that commented on the availability of data upon request. But as you can see from this table, there was a large discrepancy between what was listed as a requirement in the website versus what was actually mandated to be entered through the electronic submission software. So kind of where to go based on this initial study that we conducted. So the first goal following publication of this was really for these editors to kind of come together and move towards adopting more uniform policies versus what needs to be submitted upon manuscript entry when a trial is submitted to a journal. Because currently there's non-uniform policies, and again, that leaves room for error. And then the next step beyond that is really determining which of these criteria or additional criteria are more predictive of future randomized controlled trials retraction. In other words, which are better at distinguishing the trials that may be affected by scientific misconduct versus those that contain valid data. That study is currently ongoing. Other criteria that we weren't able to assess in this study, but that may be predictive of future retraction as well, includes whether the trial was sponsored by industry or government, whether or not one of the co-authors had previous retractions, and then more sophisticated tools like plagiarism detection software like Authenticate. Additionally, some of the quality metrics that I mentioned earlier are fairly new in the area of research reporting. So the consort guidelines were released in 2010. And the ICMJ required a data sharing statement in 2018. So, whereas now we found that the majority of journals require just a statement simply that they attested by the consort guidelines, or a statement whether or not the data is available for sharing. I think it's reasonable in the future for the expectation to be shifted more towards, having the data available for sharing upon request, or including, the specific consort checklist and flow sheet in the manuscript submission as these become, more established in the research field. But again, overall, our ultimate goal is really to develop some sort of validated screening tool that editors can use upon review of an RCT manuscript, ideally one that's able to be automated through the submission software to minimize human error. Because I think, this development will really be what makes a meaningful change and prevents these retracted articles from ever being published. All right. Thank you so much for having me.
That was fantastic, as predicted. I think one of your biggest achievements is to get, 20 plus editors of OB/GYN journals, which are somewhat, competitors in some ways, but also friends in many ways, to sign the same copyright statement and be co-authors in the same thing. That's a first. That's never been done before. I don't think it's been done in other specialty, and I think it's the first of many. So congrats, Katie.
Thank you.
I'm going to pass it on to Anne, who's going to dive in more into the rigor and especially the consort guidelines in terms of randomized controlled trials. And
great, thank you. Thank you to Dr. Bergella and the whole AJAG MFM team for the opportunity to present. As stated before, my name is Anne Bruno. I am a maternal fetal medicine fellow at the University of Utah, and I'm going to be talking about our work that was published last year in AJAG MFM entitled Rigor, Reproducibility, and Transparency of Randomized Controlled Trials in Obstetrics and Gynecology. To add to the background that has already been provided by the previous presenters, there are concerns that are ongoing both in our field of obstetrics and gynecology and the wider medical field with regards to sort of the rigor and reproducibility of trials. Some have posited that the concern is more of a lack of rigorous methodology, while others have focused on transparent reporting. As randomized controlled trials are the gold standard, being able to publish them with transparent readership for us to then be able to implement them and reproduce those findings in subsequent trials or observational studies is important. As highlighted in the last presentation, there are guidelines for trial reporting that exist. The Consolidated Standards of Reporting Trials, known as CONSORT, was most recently updated in 2010 and has a snapshot up here in the right-hand corner. This set of guidelines creates a checklist for submission of trials to publication. It includes 16 checklist items for abstracts and about 38 items for manuscripts that outlines specific things that should be included in the reporting, as well as an explanation as to why these are valuable for our interpretation of results. Additionally, pretrial registry through sites like clinicaltrials.gov has become an expectation over the past several years. This provides two sort of goals. The first is to provide publicly available information about what trials are currently enrolling. And then secondarily, it can function as a check on methodology by forcing researchers to provide portions of their methodology, including their planned primary and secondary outcomes prior to the start of their trial enrollment. Our goal was to assess randomized controlled trials in our field of obstetrics and gynecology against these sort of expectations for trial reporting. So we specifically aim to evaluate rigor, reproducibility, and transparency of published obstetrics and gynecology randomized controlled trials in 6 leading journals. And we specifically sought to assess adherence to the consort guidelines, so considering RCT publications and comparing them to the consort guidelines to assess as to whether they were adhering or not, to evaluate pretrial registration compliance, and then finally to evaluate concordance between the pretrial registry and publication for things such as primary and secondary outcomes. So this was a cross-sectional study that we carried out from July of 2017 through June of 2019, in which we identified published OBGYN randomized controlled trials in 6 journals. Those journals are listed here. 3 of those were non-obstetrics and gynecology journals, and 3 were obstetrics and gynecology journals. On the left is our flow diagram in which we identified these trials through 2 means, one using a PubMed search and then also using manual archive review of the 6 selected journals over the 2-year time frame. We then took those RCTs and saved and hard copies essentially of all of them. We did exclude non-parallel arm randomized controlled trials as those use different consort guidelines. And then 2 authors reviewed every RCT that we included in our analysis. We abstracted trial characteristics and then compared each RCT against the consort guideline checklist for both abstract and manuscript. For the purposes of our analysis, we defined adequate compliance as greater than or equal to 80% of those checklist items being completed. We then further compared each published randomized controlled trial against its pretrial registry to confirm yes or no if it was registered, and then secondarily to compare the primary and secondary outcomes that were in the pretrial registry against the published manuscript to look to see if those were concordant. We ultimately included 170 randomized controlled trials. 66% of those were from obstetrics and gynecology journals, and 34% were from non-obstetrics and gynecology journals. There was an even 50-50 split overall in the RCTs between obstetrics and gynecology content. When we did our primary analysis evaluating for compliance with the consort guidelines, we found that 34% of the RCT abstracts were not adequately compliant with the consort guidelines, and that 20% of the RCT manuscripts were not adequately compliant with consort. When we looked at specific checklist items to evaluate which ones were the most likely to be left out of the manuscript publication, these included things such as reporting ancillary analyses, reporting absolute and relative effect sizes, and differentiating between pre-specified and exploratory analyses. And we found that only 3 RCTs met all of the consort guidelines. Of all of the trials we included, the majority, 98%, were registered on an appropriate pretrial registry, although 25% of the studies were not registered until after the initiation of trial enrollment, which is not consistent with best practice. When we compared the published manuscripts to the pretrial registry, we found that 23% were discordant for primary outcomes and 68% were discordant for secondary outcomes. This included omission of primary and secondary outcomes that were listed in the pretrial registry and were left out of publication. It involved some that were flipping them, so those that were listed as primary in the registry were listed as secondary in the publication and vice versa. And then we also saw new outcome adoption. So in conclusion, of the OBGYN RCTs in these 6 high-impact journals that we reviewed, 20% were not compliant with consort, and there were major discrepancies between registry and publication. While we could not get at why necessarily this was the case, I do not necessarily hypothesize that this was authors trying to be unethical. It does highlight to us that there's an opportunity to improve the rigor, transparency, and reproducibility in our trial publication. Thinking about how this can be done, I think there's likely a multifactorial approach in which there's a role for researchers as well as journals and then readers and consumers of these to hold us to a higher standard in the future to improve the reproducibility of our science over time. And thank you again for the opportunity to share.
Thanks, Anne. That was great, so important. And, one thing I would like to discuss, we only have one more presentation by Yorgos, and then we'll open to discussion, is, journals, I think, need a major help into checking all this stuff. 22% of people reported a different primary outcome. You just told us, Anne. I mean, we need to check and beg our publisher to have enough time and staff to check, all the consortium guidelines, the quality criteria Katie went over, and all of this issue, because they're extremely important. So I'm really looking forward to ideas on how we can do that, and maybe volunteers on how we can track that at all these journals. Last formal presentation, but not least, before discussion, is by Yorgos on the number and quality of OB RCTs. Take it away, Yorgos.
Thank you, Dr. Borghella, and thank you, AJOC MFM, for the opportunity to discuss about such an interesting topic of randomized controlled trials in obstetrics and MFM. And I'm going to talk about the study that we published almost a year ago on the number and the quality of obstetric randomized controlled trials that were published in high impact factor journals, both general medical journals and OBGYN journals. What prompted us to do this study was the fact that about 100 RCTs are being registered every year on obstetrics in clinicaltrials.gov. And we wanted to identify how many of those OB RCTs are published in the top weekly medical journals and the monthly OBGYN journals recently, in the last 3 years. So we looked between 2018 and 2020. Our objective was to assess their quality in reporting and to identify the factors that were associated with publications in different journals. And then we wanted to compare the characteristics of the trials between those that met their primary outcome, the positive RCTs, and those that did not meet their outcome, the negative RCTs. So we identified all RCTs that were published during the study period in the top 4 weekly medical journals by impact factor. So we looked at the New England Journal of Medicine, the Lancet, JAMA, and the BMJ. And then at the top 4 OBGYN journals, we looked at the gray, we looked at the white, the blue, the green, and we included the pink, given the fact that AJOC MFM really wants to publish RCTs and to focus on RCTs and meta-analysis. Our primary outcome was to look at the number of RCTs with either OB or MFM research that were published in the monthly OBGYN journals versus the weekly medical journals, and the percentage of RCTs published overall and per journal. And the secondary outcomes to look at what was the proportion of the positive trials overall and per journal, and the assessment of the study characteristics of the published trials, focusing mostly on the quality assessment criteria. And the specific quality characteristics that we focused are similar to what they have already been discussed in this slide. We looked at prospective study trial registration in a publicly available repository. We looked at ethics approval statement, informed consent statement, and the statement of adherence to the consort guidelines. So overall, in the study period over these 3 years, these 9 journals published about 4,000 original articles, and 1/3 of them were RCTs. We identified a total of 137 RCTs with OB or MFM research, which was approximately 45 per year. And 33 of them, about 1/4, was published in high impact factor weekly medical journals, and the remainder was published in the OBGYN journals. Surprisingly, the majority of the studies were negative studies. Only 34% of the trials reported a positive primary outcome, and that was consistent between weekly and medical journals and the OBGYN journals. And if you look at the numbers on the graph, the weekly medical journals published about 2 to 4 OB RCTs per year. And of course, the OBGYN journals, they published more, between 8 and 10, with the exception of the White journal that was about 3 RCTs per year. Not surprisingly, the number of the RCTs that was published in the journals correlated with the impact factor, driven mainly by the weekly medical journals that they're publishing much more RCTs compared to the OBGYN journals. And looking at the characteristics of the trials between the weekly medical and the OBGYN journals, those that were published in the high impact factor medical journals, they were larger. Looking at the sample size, they were more likely to have public or government funding. They were more likely to be multi-center, international, compared to based in the United States, and they were more likely to be blinded studies. When we looked at the quality characteristics, they were similar between the two categories. And if you look at the prospective registration, about 20%, and that was similar in both groups, were not prospectively registered. And when you look at the adherence to consort, having a statement for being adherent to consort, was about 30 to 40% did not include that statement. When we looked at the characteristics between the positive and the negative trials, the negative trials were larger. Looking at the sample size, they were more likely to have funding by the government, and they were more likely to be multi-center trials. And there was no difference looking at the quality characteristics of the trials. So overall, out of about 100 OB RCTs that are registered yearly on clinicaltrials.gov, less than 50%, about 45, are published in the top peer-reviewed journals. 1/4 is published in the high impact factor weekly medical journals, and the remainder in OBGYN journals. And about 1/3 of these trials are positive trials. The majority are negative for the primary outcome examined. The studies that were published in the weekly medical journals were larger. They were more likely to be government funded, international, multi-center, and double-blind trials. And overall, 73% of the RCTs were prospectively registered, meaning that the remainder were not. 1.5 were not registered at all in a public repository, and about 25% were retrospectively registered after the enrollment of the first patient. Thank you. Thank you again, Dr. Berghella.
Oh, thank you very much, Yorgos. That was wonderful. I think one thing I want to emphasize from your presentation is that negative RCTs are being published. It's really important that we don't publish just a positive RCT. Whomever is listening, and as you know, thousands seems to be listening to this podcast. It's really important for everyone, for authors, for institutions, for researchers, for editors and journals, to publish, the negatives as well as the positive trials. And I think I hear too many, maybe even young people, spend years on a trial and it gets negative, and it's not important. I'm not going to report it. It's extremely, extremely important to report the negative data. I'm going to open it up to discussion now that we have all the presentations. We have a healthy 20 minutes to discuss. Since Deirdre and Nathan are around, maybe I'll ask you first if you have any comments. Deirdre first, if you want to say anything.
Sure. Well, first, I want to say congratulations to Jekka, Katie, Ann, and Yorgos. You all presented beautifully, and these are very important trials. And want to highlight that 2 of you are residents, 1 of you is a fellow, and 1 is junior faculty. So I know Vince feels this way too, that our future is bright, and these are exciting. I think I want to harken back, Vince, to something you said earlier. Anyone who's ever done an RCT has new respect for, the blood, sweat, and tears that they take. They RCTs, like you said, 5 years to enroll 61 patients, but these are some of the more important questions that, and this is level 1 data. This is the most important data that we can, that we can really put forth. And I think what, the theme for today, I think what's really coming out is a couple of things. One is that in obstetrics, they're not well funded. That may be because, we're not doing a lot of drug studies and things like that. But we need so many studies in, obstetric best practices. I think back to you, Vince, again, what you showed in the beginning, some of the best trials are, the ideas that you come up with on labor and delivery. When you see a practice style, a practice management that you question, why do we do this? And but I think I think that understanding who's funding these trials, NIH is really, NICHD, an important place to really be able to fund very large scale trials. But some of the best ones can be that question that you ask, like our fellow Meryl Sperling, why, do you have to fast before glucola or not? And, there's some very simple, straightforward things you can do. I'm wondering if some of the lack of funding and the fact that a lot of our studies, if they're not government funded, but those that are in academia that seem to have less results reporting and less, kind of start to finish, and maybe some more of the errors may just be due to lack of funding. I'd love to hear others' thoughts on that.
Really, really important thoughts. And, we do this by design. I want, the young people to talk much more than us. And I'm going to invite as many young people to the future ones as I can. They're the future and the present of our specialty. Nathan, I don't know if you have any comments on what Deidre say or anything else.
Yes, I do. And thanks to all of you for such excellent presentations. I'm really privileged to be alongside you today. The story that comes out to me in listening to everyone present is similar to what everyone says, which is just that it's so hard to do good research. And this is such a double-edged sword presenting this information, because we want people to do research. We want them to invest in the research effort, to participate and enjoy the gratification and the fruits of research. And yet we also want to empower them and adequately resource them to do it well. And, I was able to participate, like many of you, in an RCT in fellowship. And, I now can see sort of between the lines when we hear about so many trials being non-funded by external institutions like the NIH or industry. I mean, those trials are really just the enthusiasm and the ambition of curious, interested, dedicated people. But the story of those not getting pushed through all the way to publication is, to me, one of resources. And, I think we all have seen people initiate projects and then leave the institution when their training ends, or have support run out in some way, or some other constraint limit their ability to finish. And so, I think we want to simultaneously continue to engage our community members, places that are not connected to ivory tower resources, and to continue to encourage them to participate and come up with ideas and contribute their valuable insights, while also maybe finding a new framework or a new way to support them so that their implementation and execution is ethical, in the sense that their ideas are ones that are impactful, whether the hypothesis is supported or not, and in a way that they can get those results out and disseminated to really honor the generosity of their participants, like you mentioned.
Any comments from anybody else? Feel free to jump in. I tend to talk too much. I just really don't want to take over.
I think it's extremely well said by Nathan, and I think we have to look at both the researchers, but also the journals, and the researchers have been doing like an excellent job, putting sweat and tear into doing research, and they need to be further supported by our data, but they need to continue to do what they have been doing, because there is what I loved most about this research project is that we created a list of all 137 of BRCTs that were done over just a period of 3 years. And there was some great, amazing research that is done all over the world. So going back to what you said, Dr. Bergella, I think that, first of all, researchers shouldn't be disappointed when they have a negative outcome, because in research, a negative outcome is a very, very important finding that improves patient care. So that's the first thing, and that's what I've been hearing about many people who, they start a trial and they get disappointed because it may be futile because they need more patients. But some of them, they have negative data and they don't want to publish it, or some of the editors do not see it as an important trial because of the negative outcome. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is going to Katie's excellent work and of course Ant's work and Zeka's work, is that looking at the quality of the data and how the journals can improve the way that they screen through trials, so they can avoid falsified data, but they can also, again, it's in the end, it's all about improving patient care, and we want to make sure that what we publish is the best that we have in order to improve our patients' care. So
I love what you said, Yorgos. I couldn't say it better. So, let me emphasize a couple of things you say that are so important. When you submit your randomized trial, don't stop at the first submission, please. You have everybody kind of show that many randomized studies are not published. You have to publish. Is the generosity of your patient. You spend 5-10 years, sometimes more, on one thing. You just cannot not publish. To the editors, really important. That's why I kind of wanted Educam FM. We're not a huge specialty, obstetrics, high risk, etc. To me, even if you randomize 40 patients, but it's well done, it's quality, it's pre-registered, it's prospective, you did it, you have a database that you can provide it fast and everything, that should be published, because it could be part of a meta-analysis. It could, somebody could hopefully copy. That's what you want to do when you do research. The more copied you get, the better you do. So those are two extremely important messages I think that this stream could give our audience. Any other comments on these issues?
I would like to just ask Anne Bruno, who just finished an RCT. Sorry to out you, Anne, but I'm curious. You have the freshest perspective of any of us on this, having just you're working through writing and submitting. I don't actually know where you are, but I want to know what you think about all of this.
Yeah, I think it highlights sort of, as you said earlier, the double-edged sword, or sort of the dichotomy of it's a lot of work to do a randomized controlled trial. I have been very fortunate to be able to do one during the course of my fellowship. And as Dr. Blue said, we're just sort of getting it into the writing and submitting stages right now. And I think it does highlight the funding piece as well. I was able to apply and get a seed grant that funded our project, but even with that and having some funding, it's really difficult to sort of make ends meet to carry out an RCT. And so you can see why these sometimes don't make it across the finish line. And so I think the funding piece is something that's important. I also think that the sort of consort piece, I was very cognizant of that, because I at the same time was working on this study with Dr. Blue. And so even when I was developing my RCT, I spent a lot of time with the consort guidelines and sort of thinking through methodology. And so I think it's important for us to be sort of thinking about those things for publication, even when we are in the development phases, to make sure that we're really developing rigorous methodology and thinking through all of those steps and doing the pretrial registry and whatnot. So I will say that I think that those, for me, have been great learning experiences as a fellow, and sort of emphasized to me, though, that it takes a lot of forethought and foresight to sort of think through, like, when I get to the end of this and want to submit it for publication, making sure that you're really crossing your T's and dotting your I's from the start to make it rigorous and transparent in how you ultimately report it. So it's hard work, and so I can see why it's really valuable, and I think all of us should keep pushing it forward.
My experience in life is that sometimes things, the more difficult they are, even on the personal level, as well as professional, the more reward you get. And I think randomized trials are a perfect example of something that is extremely difficult to do well and to do at all, but that eventually bring the biggest chance at, changing medicine for the better, improving lives, etc. Katie, do you have any comments yourself?
I was just going to say, kind of as Anne was alluding to, I think it will be helpful for this issue as well, kind of developing this uniform criteria for randomized controlled trials in terms of assurance of their quality, because I think it may be a lot less daunting to kind of pursue a randomized controlled trial for like a new researcher if they know, that they need to follow the consort guideline checklist and that they need to have certain things in place when they're designing their study. Because that will kind of reassure that their data is of high quality and increase the likelihood that it'll go on to publication. So I think it's nice that kind of all of our projects work together, because there is a clear need for more randomized controlled trials in our field. And I think, in addition to funding, something that may help with that is just a clear set of guidelines. When people pursue these studies, their data will be, able to be trusted and more likely to be published.
And, the world is in your hands. You mentioned software, Katie, which, we have discussed so much in the last few years. We need, even at AJOG MFM, I need some more automation. Otherwise, you need hundreds of people to check all these randomized studies and, 20, 30, 40 criteria, so many consort points. I think it'd be nice, authenticate that checks, how much overlap there is, with different publications, but also have some kind of automated checklist that checks the registration, the dates. So I'm really looking forward to more research on that, more help, and to all of us, we're all volunteers at these journals, and to kind of come together and increase the quality. Jack, when I met you, you were so impressive, and you were very impressed with today. Any comments from you?
I feel so grateful to be a part of this group and this incredible discussion. I think I would echo what everyone else has said. We all serve pregnant people in MFM and obstetrics, and right now, at a time when around 20% of our practice is based on level 1 evidence, it's so critical to, as a field, develop resources and standard methods to get this research to serve our patients. I'm really excited that this is something that's being looked at across the board, and I hope it leads to more effective treatments and better quality care for the people that we serve.
Thank you. And, we'll do another sessions on this. There are many who have looked at, for example, ACOG and SMFM guidelines. How many of those recommendations are based on RCTs, that we have looked. We actually will show soon that if you participate in RCT, you're going to have better outcomes if you don't participate in RCT. There's so much on RCT data in obstetrics, in pregnancy. Next week we'll talk about COVID, and obviously we should have had much sooner, COVID vaccine, RCTs to help our women. One personal issue, we only have 5 minutes left. The pre-registration issue we all touched on, and it's so important. And I have been part of many editorial boards. Now the recommendation to pre-register your trial has been around a long time. So I think there is little excuse to say, I started a trial in 2020 or 2022 and I haven't pre-registered it. And there are many reasons for that. The issue I've seen many times is that people sometimes do make honest mistakes. And if you do a large trial and you registered it 2 months late, what should editors do? I think that's not coming up anymore much. But I want to keep as many hard rules as possible. But I also, we're talking about generosity. You randomize 1,000 patients and you have registered the trial a month late, and you can show me the 1,000 consent forms, and you can show me the IRB and the consent forms. It's we want to hit 1,000, so to speak, in a baseball term, but we also need to and we need to improve the quality, but we also need to publish trials as long as they're done and they're through. Thank God it doesn't come up much, because all of you doing trials are registering. But I also want to kind of hit the other point that there are many issues that you need to be cognizant on, and you need to be very careful making sure you publish quality data. Any other kind of finishing comments or issue you guys want to bring up?
I was just going to dovetail on Katie's comment, about providing resources and frameworks to support researchers in meeting these goals up front. I love the idea of like an RCT obstetrics toolkit, something that we could sort of like put together a toolkit of sort of a workflow or of guidelines and resources for folks who maybe are not connected to large institutional resources, but have a good idea, and something to sort of set everyone up for success and start with sort of a common, maybe a common playing field from the outset. So that is ripe for the taking. Whoever is enthusiastic and interested, I'm willing to collaborate with you on that.
That's a great idea. That's what I'm hoping this live streams bring up. That's a wonderful idea. We could post it, hopefully all of these journals, PANCAK and many others, and people could, because sometimes there is mentorship missing, Nathan. Like people are well intentioned, but nobody tells them that you need to pre-register, or there are consort guidelines there, before you randomize your first 10 patients, and this will be really important. And as you could see, we publish with all the editors in OBGYN. I think we could get them all to agree that to have them on their website.
And also teaching, right? Teaching our residents, teaching our medical students about what is pre-trial registration, what is consort. But I think that's also important.
Yeah, so important. I to emphasize a couple of positive things, I'm a very much of a glass half full guy. I think that Jekka talked about 4,276 RCTs, and also that we're going at a faster rate in terms of more RCTs than other specialties. There are some positive things. We published 44 at the age of MFM alone, and we're getting more and more. SMFM, I think, has about 50 randomized studies every year that get presented. So it's I think we're moving at least in the right direction. I think there were another comment. Did I miss? If not, I think we're near the top of the hour. This was a great discussion. I hope we have spread some passion and some guidance on how to do more randomized studies. Each of us may participate in some and be proud of them, but we need so many more. And some of the most basic things, like we sometimes don't even know. We think it's delivering vaginally is better for everyone, but we're really not sure. We need randomized study on everything. And I hope we have empowered many to improve the 145 million births around there, and also that we have kind of pushed people who have done some, who haven't published them, people who are planning them to do them in a better way, and also offered a safe haven to of our journals to for this great research to be published on. So go on, randomized, and again, thanks for being with me. Thank you, Yorgos and Katie, Jekka, Nathan, and Deirdre. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.